Well, because we're talking about the origins of life, can you tell us, I suppose, about the ExoMars mission and what this intends to achieve with regards to the origins of life?
Yes, well, absolutely. You mentioned at the top of the show that I was currently the president of the Astrobiology Society of Britain, and astrobiology is essentially the science of the origins of life and whether or not we are alone in the universe, whether or not life exists elsewhere in the universe, in the galaxy, or whether or not we are example of life number one and the only example of life. So ExoMars, for example, is a European Space Agency mission. It's set for launch 2016. It is going to Mars on the back of the NASA mission, the Mars Science Laboratory. And Mars has currently a rover, a NASA rover, scuttling around its surface called Curiosity, whose job it is to look at whether or not Mars could ever have held the conditions for life to exist on it. Now, ExoMars next year is going to look at something slightly different. It's going to look, as the NASA rover is doing now, at the geology of Mars to see whether or not it could have been habitable, but also it is specifically going to look for evidence of extinct or possibly even extant, that means still living, life. So that's the big thing about ExoMars. It is set to look for traces of life on Mars, and that would be fascinating and revolutionary should we find any.
So when it comes back to Earth, with regards to life on Earth, would you say plants or animals were the first form of life to appear on Earth, and where did it come from? Whichever was the first.
Good question. What came first? The ultimate chicken and egg problem. The simple answer, of course, is we don't know, but the consensus at the moment is that probably the simplest form of life was something akin to a bacterium. So a simple bacterial cell, which essentially is a very small bag of salty organic chemicals, which is a factory. It's a factory for doing things, for making other chemicals. And it is probably one of the simplest forms of life. We ourselves and many other higher forms of life, couldn't exist without bacteria. We use bacteria in our gut, for example, to digest our food. They're in our mouth. They're everywhere.
So if we didn't have bacteria, we'd die. Even though something disgusting we think of that we don't like.
We would be in trouble.
We need.
Yeah. You mentioned as well at the beginning about cows producing methane. Of course, it's not the cows really that produces the methane. It's the bacterium in the cow's rumen in the stomach that produces the methane. So bacteria are actually pretty important.
Okay. Well, did life originate on Earth? Or is there a possibility it came from somewhere else?
Again, very, very good question.
Not necessarily life as we know it, but the basis of a life. Yeah. Was that an Earth-based thing? Or is it possible that it came from elsewhere?
There are, as you've alluded to there, Adil, these two main ideas about the origins of life on Earth. One is that life started on Earth and began on Earth, and the other is that life on Earth was seeded. So in the early period of the Earth's geological history, say 4.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, it's pretty well assumed that and pretty well established that the Earth was being bombarded by meteorites, cometary fragments, bits of the early solar system. And it is quite possible, according to this theorem, it's quite possible that some of these fragments could have held within them the kernel, the germ of life itself. These things then arrive on the Earth, find the Earth's environment to their liking, and are able to use the Earth as a source of energy and nutriments, and consequently grow. And from that, life begins. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem of how life ultimately began somewhere else in the universe, but the idea that life was seeded by life from another part of the universe is called panspermia, and it's been with us, that particular hypothesis, for many, many years. Yeah.
So what's so special about Earth that it harbours life when we've got two very close neighbours called Venus and Mars, and there's many other things in the atmosphere, in the solar system, or in other solar systems? Why do we think Earth is so special?
Well, it's a great question. Earth now is very different to any other body in our solar system that we're aware of, because we know that our Earth has been completely transformed by life. So, for example, oxygen in our atmosphere is only present because of life. So if there were no life, there'd be no oxygen in the atmosphere, and our atmosphere would be akin to something like Mars. So the only reason...
So hang on, what's the atmosphere of Mars like in comparison to Mars?
Well, Mars is pretty much nitrogen-based, as ours is. But the oxygen that we have is produced by photosynthetic organisms and plant life and things like that. So life is a source of the oxygen in our atmospheres. And this is a big point, actually, because there's an enormous area of astronomy now where scientists are looking for planets orbiting other stars. This is the search for exoplanets. And we know now that there are a vast number of exoplanets in different solar systems all over the galaxy. And one of the things that scientists would really like to do is find out what their atmospheres are made of, because the idea is if you see a large amount of oxygen in those atmospheres, it could be a marker or a signature that life exists there.
So the fact that we've got the gas we need to breathe means that we exist, is what you're saying? Or means something like us exist.
Yeah, absolutely. It probably was the case that the first organisms, the first primitive forms of life on Earth, almost certainly did not use oxygen to breathe. They didn't need oxygen. They were anaerobic because our atmosphere just contained very little oxygen. So they needed to get their energy from other sources.
That brings me on to the next question, which is, were the conditions on life better and more suited to life starting than they are now? I suppose, would life be able to start now just from scratch, or would it prefer to have been in the more hostile conditions of the start of the...
Again, it's a super question. It's a super question. My view is that I think that life began under what we might consider today, from the perspective of humankind, are quite extreme conditions. So high temperatures, high pressures, perhaps extremes of salinity, salt solutions, perhaps extremes of acidity or alkalinity. Those are the conditions that may well have been suited to the earliest forms, most primitive forms of life, because there was a considerable amount of energy in these environments. Oxygen probably didn't play an enormous part in it, and it's almost certain that the first forms of life were considerably more hardy than us. And we know quite a lot about...
So I suppose simpler but more resilient.
Simpler but more resilient, yeah. And we know a lot about that from our studies of what are called extremophiles. These are bacteria and archaea, small single-celled organisms that live under extreme conditions, in hot battery acid, are under extremely high pressures, or 3 or 4 kilometers deep underneath the earth, living in little crevices in rocks. Fascinating, remarkable.
Okay, so with us and animals like us, we all eat foods that are kind of carbohydrates, carbon-based foods. We eat proteins, fats, and sugars. If you think of something like dynamite, that clearly has a lot of energy in it because it can blow up. But why can't we eat that? Why do we eat things that are carbon-based, like proteins and carbs?
Again, great question. I guess all of us need to eat to generate the fuel, to generate the energy that allows us to do things. So we can only eat stuff that our internal bodies can metabolize, for want of a better word, that can break down. So if we could break down, if humans could break down rocks and sand and grit, we'd be chomping on bits of rock from the Strid or from Ilkley Moor. But we can't do that. We don't derive satisfactory energy sources from that. Although other organisms, more primitive organisms do, and they do eat rock. So almost anything chemical can be considered as fuel for some organism by life, as long as there is a chemical mechanism for breaking it down and extracting energy.
So that brings us on to an interesting question then, because last week we had a physicist on who said Pluto's too cold to harbour life. So in your opinion, seeing as there are methane, which contains a lot of energy, and other gases on Pluto, is it, in your opinion, possible to harbour life of some sort of life on Pluto?
Well, in principle, yes. And it's the same thing. People said, oh, you couldn't possibly have life living on Venus because Venus is like broiling hot. But the thing about Venus is, as you go up in the atmosphere of Venus, it starts to get colder, where things can, in principle, life could possibly exist. And it's the same with Pluto and other icy worlds. Pluto is cold on the top, but as you go down deeper and deeper towards the centre, so it starts to get hotter. And under those conditions, there might be areas under the crust of these icy world planets in which life could very well exist. Yeah. So in principle, it's possible.
But I suppose starting it would be more difficult than
starting
once
it
it's there.
Might be a challenge. And again, it goes to the heart of the question: Did life on Earth begin on Earth, or did it come from somewhere else? But with the icy worlds, just in the context of icy worlds, NASA, for example, in the US and the European Space Agency are seriously considering missions to these icy worlds to try to look for the possibilities, whether or not these planets could in fact be habitable to life as we know it. So it's not just a pipe dream, it could well happen one day.
So if something's required to start life on Pluto, well, we as humans like to think of ourselves as, well, some of us in some respects like to think of ourselves as the creators of life, and we create artificial intelligence. And once it's created, would you say that's in some respects alive? Or...
Yeah, for me, I have quite a pluralist view on this. I think there are as many different definitions. Well, there are as many different definitions of life as people thinking about the topic and studying the topic. The one thing that we can say about it is that there is no universal consensus that life is this and living is that. I think, for me as a chemist, as a scientist, one of the things that really goes to the heart of living systems is living systems are maintained far from equilibrium. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah. What does that mean?
What does that mean? It means that living systems are on the edge of stability, because if they didn't have the right conditions or the right environment around them, they would cease to exist in that particular state. So consider us. You take away our food and water for a goodly number of days, and we're not going to do too well on it. You deprive of us of oxygen and food and water for months, and we're going to die. Of course, dying in this context just means we become a different state. So the chemicals in our body are not in the same form as they were when we're living.
Effectively become
bacteria
something
and
fungi and stuff like that.
Yeah, in scientific terms, we head towards thermodynamic equilibrium. It's another way of saying all the atoms, complicated term, all the atoms in our body rearrange themselves so that they're more stable. So life is, in a way, defined by instability.
So would you argue that computers are alive? I mean, you can turn them off.
You can turn them off, that's true, but you can program computers to simulate some of the properties of life, and I believe it's possible to develop computers that will start to think for themselves and learn from experience. So that's a really important aspect of life. Life interacts with its environment, so it's in intimate contact with its environment, but life responds to that environment and does different things according to how the environment changes. So if one had something that we as a human could look at and say it's not alive, like it's a computer program, we don't think it's alive, but it has some of the properties of a living thing, like the ability to learn from mistakes or to evolve. Who's to say that that could not have an element of livingness within it?
So it's all about our definitions, really.
It's all about
we're
a definition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that I suppose we'll finish this discussion off on something that quite often gets discussed. I mean, we're all carbon based. Every kind of part of our body has some sort of carbon in it, or is related to carbon. We breathe in carbon dioxide and produce carbon based fuels. Is there any possibility of biological life as we know it, based on, for instance, something like silicon, which is similar to carbon, but is distinctly different? Is there any possibility of that?
Well, I think one could start off by saying we in our own lives and many other forms of biological life as we know them uses silicon. So silicon is there. Silicon's an important part. The tips of nettles, when you get stung by nettles, that's a little silicon syringe which penetrates your skin, pumps poison into you. So it is there already. It is used in life. But could silicon replace carbon? It's a really tough one, because the chemical properties of silicon are actually quite different to those of carbon. So if it did replace it, some of the natural consequences of those differences in chemical properties would necessarily play out in silicon life. Very recently, 2010, I think it was 2009, 2010, a group of American scientists published a paper in Nature saying that they had discovered a bacterium in which the phosphorus of the DNA, and phosphorus is a really important element in DNA, it's actually centrally important to the operation of DNA, was replaced by another element called arsenic. And that was, had it been true, would have been a stunning discovery, probably Nobel Prize worthy. However, I think the general consensus now, 6 years on, is that substitution of arsenic for phosphorus in DNA probably did not take place. It's all to do with the fact that the chemistries are quite different.
Was kind of wasted.
It appears that they did. The scientists themselves who did the original study did some great science, but they maybe over-egged it slightly. And I think excited scientists. I think some of the subsequent careful experimentation has demonstrated that they didn't actually prove what they said they were going to prove. However, there's no guarantee that somebody in the future will find an example of that, a silicon-based life form, or a form of life in which carbon or phosphorus or some other important element of life is replaced by another element. We just don't know. It hasn't happened yet, but that doesn't mean to say it isn't going to.